Chapter 1. The Birth of a Nation. Russia's story begins long ago in a time of mystery. The land was wild, covered in deep forests and wide rivers. Cold winters brought ice and snow. Summers were short but full of life. Animals roamed free, and the rivers carried fish to the people. It was a land of beauty, but also danger. The first people who lived here were Slavic tribes. They built small villages near rivers. Water was their road, their lifeline. It gave them food, helped them travel, and connected them to distant lands. These early Slavs were farmers, hunters, and traders. They grew wheat and rye, raised animals, and fished in the rivers. Life was simple but hard. Winters were cruel, and wars between tribes were common. The Slavs believed in many gods. They worshipped the sun, the earth, and the spirits of nature. Fire was sacred. They gathered around it to tell stories, sing songs, and honor their ancestors. Each village had a leader, a wise elder who made decisions for the people. But there was no single ruler. No one united the land. Then strangers arrived. They came from the north, sailing down the great rivers in long wooden ships. They were warriors, traders, and explorers. Some called them Vikings, but in Russia they were known as the Varangians. They had strong ships, sharp swords, and a thirst for adventure. The Slavs feared them at first. The Varangians were tall, with light hair and fierce eyes. They fought bravely and took what they wanted. But they were also clever traders. They did not come only to conquer. They came to do business. Silver, fur, honey, and amber flowed through their hands. They built strongholds, collected taxes, and made alliances. One Varangian leader changed history. His name was Rurik. The Slavic tribes, tired of fighting each other, invited him to rule. They wanted a strong leader, someone to bring order. Rurik accepted. He settled in the north, in a town called Novgorod. From there, he built his power. His family would rule Russia for centuries. But the true heart of Russia was still to the south. There, by the Dnieper River, lay a great city, Kiev. It was rich and powerful. Merchants from the east and west came to trade. Markets were full of spices, silk, gold, and fine weapons. The people of Kiev were strong, proud, and ready for greatness. Oleg, Rurik's successor, saw the city's power. He wanted it for himself. His warriors rode to Kiev, swords shining in the sun. The city's rulers fell. Oleg entered through the gates and declared, "Let this be the mother of all Russian cities." And so, Kiev became the center of the new kingdom, Kievan Rus. Under Oleg, the Rus grew strong. The people farmed the land, built churches, and traded with the mighty Byzantine Empire. Gold and jewels flowed from Constantinople, the great city of the East. The Rus admired its beauty. They wanted its knowledge, its art, and its faith. Then came a moment that changed everything. A great prince, Vladimir, ruled over Kiev. He was powerful but restless. He searched for something greater than war. He wanted a new faith, a new path for his people. He sent messengers to study different religions, Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. The messengers traveled far. They saw the mosques of the Muslim world. They listened to the prayers of the Jews. But when they entered the churches of Constantinople, they were awestruck. The walls were covered in gold. Candles flickered. The sound of singing filled the air. It felt like heaven on earth. They returned to Kiev and told Vladimir, "We knew not if we were in heaven or on earth." Vladimir made his choice. He embraced Christianity. He ordered the people of Kiev to be baptized in the river. The cold water washed over them, marking a new beginning. The old gods were left behind. The cross replaced the sword as a symbol of power. With this act, Kievan Rus became part of the Christian world. The church brought books, learning, and a new way of life. Priests taught the people to read and write. The Slavic language was written down for the first time. Churches rose, their domes shining in the sun. The people prayed, sang hymns, and found comfort in their faith. But power is never safe. After Vladimir, his sons fought for the throne. Brothers turned against brothers. The kingdom was torn apart by war. Enemies saw weakness. From the east, new invaders came, fierce and unstoppable. They rode like the wind, their arrows flying like rain. The Mongols. The Mongols struck with fury. Kiev burned. The streets ran with blood. The golden age of Kievan Rus was over. The land fell under Mongol rule. The people suffered, but they did not forget who they were. Their faith, their language, their spirit remained. In the north, a new power was rising. A city built on rivers and trade. A city of strong walls and proud warriors. Moscow. It would rise from the ashes. It would fight to free Russia. And one day, it would rule them all. This was only the beginning. Chapter 2. Moscow rises. The 14th century was a time of change. Russia was not yet free. The Mongols ruled over the land, demanding tribute from the people. Their power was strong, and their reach seemed endless. The Russian princes paid them gold, afraid of their wrath. But in the shadows, a new city was rising. Its name was Moscow. At first, Moscow was small. It was not as grand as Kiev had been, but it had a secret, its location. Moscow sat near rivers, making it a center for trade. People brought furs, grain, and other goods to its markets. Slowly, the city grew richer and stronger. Its walls were rebuilt with wood, then stone. The people of Moscow began to hope. Could their city be the one to lead Russia? In the 14th century, Moscow gained a clever leader, Ivan I, known as Ivan Moneybag. He was not a warrior, but a strategist. Ivan made deals with the Mongols, gaining their trust. They allowed him to collect taxes from other Russian cities. Ivan kept much of the money for Moscow. With this wealth, he strengthened the city. He invited traders, built churches, and made Moscow the seat of the Orthodox Church. Step by step, Moscow became important. But it was still under Mongol control. Years passed, and new leaders came to power in Moscow. The city faced challenges. Fires destroyed homes, enemies attacked, and hunger gripped the land. But the people of Moscow did not give up. They rebuilt their city each time. They believed in their future. They believed Moscow could unite the Russian lands. In the 15th century, Moscow's moment finally came. A new leader took the throne, Ivan III. History would remember him as Ivan the Great. He was tall, strong, and determined. Ivan dreamed of freedom. He wanted to end the Mongol rule over Russia. He wanted Moscow to be a true capital, not a servant to foreign powers. Ivan began by uniting the Russian lands. Many princes ruled small regions, often fighting each other. Ivan convinced some to join him peacefully. Others he defeated in battle. Slowly, the pieces of Russia came together under Moscow's banner. The people started to see Ivan as their protector, their hope for a stronger nation. But the Mongols were still a threat. They demanded tribute from Moscow, just as they had for years. Ivan decided to say no. He refused to pay. The Mongols sent their armies to punish Moscow. The air was filled with tension. Would Ivan's gamble lead to freedom or destruction? The year was 1480. Ivan and his army faced the Mongols at the Ugra River. Both sides stood on opposite banks, staring at each other. Days passed. The soldiers waited, their weapons ready. The people of Moscow prayed for victory. Fear filled the air. If Ivan lost, the Mongols would burn Moscow to the ground. And then, the Mongols retreated. Without a fight, they turned and left. No one knew exactly why. Some said the Mongols were afraid of Ivan's strength. Others believed they were weakened by problems in their own lands. Whatever the reason, the result was clear. Russia was free. The Mongol yoke had been broken. The bells of Moscow rang out. The people cheered in the streets. Ivan returned to the city as a hero. His victory was not just for Moscow, it was for all of Russia. The dream of a united, independent nation was now closer than ever. Ivan was not finished. He wanted to make Moscow a true center of power. He rebuilt the Kremlin, the heart of the city. Stone walls replaced the old wooden ones. Towers and gates rose high, strong and proud. Inside, he built churches with golden domes that shone in the sunlight. Moscow became a symbol of strength and faith. It was no longer just a city. It was the soul of Russia. But Ivan's rule was not without challenges. Some Russian princes still resisted his authority. Others plotted against him in secret. Ivan dealt with them harshly. He wanted no rivals. His focus was on uniting Russia, no matter the cost. Ivan also looked beyond Russia's borders. He married Sophia Paleolog, a Byzantine princess. Her family once ruled the great Byzantine Empire, but it had fallen to the Turks. Through this marriage, Ivan claimed a connection to the old empire. He began to call himself Tsar, a title linked to Caesar, the rulers of ancient Rome. Ivan saw Moscow as the third Rome, a city destined for greatness. As Ivan grew older, his vision for Russia became clearer. He wanted a strong, unified state with Moscow at its heart. He created laws to bring order and control. He reduced the power of the boyars, the rich nobles who once ruled over the peasants. The people saw him as both a ruler and a protector. By the time Ivan died in 1505, Moscow was no longer a small city. It was a great power, ready to shape the future of Russia. But the story of Moscow's rise was far from over. New leaders would come. New challenges would test the city's strength. Yet one thing was clear. Moscow was the heart of Russia, and it would beat strong for centuries to come. As the sun set over the Kremlin, its golden domes glowing in the fading light, the people of Moscow looked to the future. Their city had survived fire, war, and foreign rule. It had grown from a small settlement into the center of a nation. Suspense lingered in the air. What would Moscow become? What would Russia become? Only time would tell. Chapter 3. Ivan the Terrible. Ivan IV, known to history as Ivan the Terrible, was born in 1530. His life began in the shadows of tragedy. When he was just 3 years old, his father, Grand Prince Vasily, died. This left little Ivan as the ruler of Moscow, but a child could not lead. Power fell into the hands of the boyars, Russia's noble families. They were supposed to protect him, but instead they fought each other for control. Ivan grew up surrounded by cruelty. The boyars argued, plotted, and even killed each other in his presence. He saw betrayal and greed everywhere. Lonely and scared, Ivan often roamed the halls of the Kremlin. He spent hours in the churches praying for peace. Yet inside him, anger began to grow. He was a child, but he felt powerless. This anger would shape his future. When Ivan was 16, he took control of his destiny. In 1547, he was crowned as the first Tsar of Russia. The word Tsar came from Caesar, symbolizing great power. Ivan believed that his authority came from God. The crown was heavy, but he wore it with pride. Now, he was not just a ruler. He was the ruler of all Russia. At first, Ivan ruled wisely. He wanted to make Russia stronger and more united. He created new laws to bring justice to the land. He gathered a council of advisors, choosing men not because of their noble birth, but because of their abilities. He reformed the military, creating a stronger army to defend Russia's borders. These were good years. The people called him Ivan the Great. But Ivan wanted more than just a strong Russia. He wanted to expand its borders. His dream was to make Russia a great empire. In 1552, he turned his eyes to Kazan, a city ruled by the Tatars. It was a powerful fortress, surrounded by high walls and brave warriors. Ivan led his army to battle. Cannons roared, arrows flew, and men fought fiercely. After weeks of fighting, Kazan fell. The victory was glorious. Bells rang across Moscow. The people cheered their Tsar. Ivan ordered the construction of a cathedral to celebrate the victory. It would stand in Red Square near the Kremlin. Its colorful domes rose toward the sky, each one unique. Today, we know it as St. Basil's Cathedral, one of Russia's most famous landmarks. It was a symbol of Ivan's greatness, a reminder of his power. But not all of Ivan's story was filled with triumph. Tragedy and darkness followed him. In 1560, his beloved wife, Anastasia, died. Her death broke his heart. Ivan believed that she had been poisoned by the boyars. His grief turned to rage. He no longer trusted anyone. The kind and wise ruler began to change. Ivan created a special force called the Oprichnina. These men wore black robes and rode black horses. They were his secret police, loyal only to him. They hunted down anyone Ivan thought was a threat. The boyars were their main target. Many were arrested, tortured, and killed. Villages were burned, and innocent people suffered. Fear spread across the land. The people whispered stories of Ivan's cruelty. They began to call him Ivan the Terrible. But Ivan's fury did not stop with the boyars. In 1570, he turned against the city of Novgorod. He believed that its leaders were plotting against him. His army marched into the city. What followed was a tragedy. Thousands of people were killed. Homes and churches were destroyed. The streets of Novgorod ran with blood. It was one of the darkest moments of Ivan's reign. Ivan's personal life was filled with pain. He had many children, but only a few survived. In 1581, an argument with his eldest son turned violent. In a moment of rage, Ivan struck his son with a staff. The blow was fatal. Ivan's son and heir lay dead at his feet. The Tsar wept for days, but nothing could undo what had happened. This tragedy haunted him for the rest of his life. Despite his cruelty, Ivan was a complex figure. He was deeply religious and spent hours in prayer. He wrote letters filled with passion and intelligence. He cared about his people in his own way, building schools and printing books. But his paranoia and anger overshadowed his achievements. In 1584, Ivan fell ill. He died at the age of 54 while playing a game of chess. His death marked the end of an era. He left behind a country larger and more powerful than when he had become Tsar. But it was also a land filled with fear and suffering. Ivan the Terrible's reign was a mix of greatness and terror. He built an empire, but ruled with an iron fist. He dreamed of unity, but brought division. His name still echoes in history, a reminder of the power and the danger of unchecked ambition. As the bells of Moscow rang after his death, the people wondered, what would the future hold for Russia? The story was far from over. Chapter 4: The Age of Peter the Great. Peter the Great was born in 1672. From the moment he was young, Peter stood out. He was tall, very tall, and full of energy. Unlike other princes, he loved adventure. He played with tools, learned about ships, and spent hours exploring. But Peter's childhood was not easy. His family was divided by power struggles. His father died when Peter was young, and his half-sister tried to control the throne. Chaos and fear surrounded him. But Peter survived. He grew stronger, smarter, and more determined. When Peter became Tsar in 1682, Russia was still a land of traditions. The country was isolated from Europe. Most people were peasants, living in wooden houses and farming the land. The nobles, called boyars, held great power. They wore long robes and beards, symbols of their old ways. Russia had no navy and a weak army. It was a giant country, but far behind its western neighbors. Peter wanted to change this. He had big dreams. He wanted Russia to be powerful, modern, and respected. To do this, he needed to learn. In 1697, Peter left Russia to travel through Europe. No Tsar had ever done this before. He wanted to see how other countries worked, how they built ships, how they fought wars, and how they lived. Peter traveled in disguise, calling himself a simple carpenter. But his height and energy made him hard to miss. In the Netherlands, he studied shipbuilding. In England, he learned about modern cities. He visited factories, universities, and army camps. Everywhere he went, he asked questions. He even worked in shipyards, building ships with his own hands. Peter was amazed by what he saw. He decided that Russia must change, no matter the cost. When Peter returned to Russia, he acted quickly. He ordered the nobles to shave their beards and wear Western clothes. Many were shocked and resisted, but Peter would not listen to complaints. He built new schools to teach modern science, engineering, and navigation. He invited experts from Europe to come to Russia and teach. The Tsar wanted his people to look and think like Europeans. One of Peter's greatest goals was to create a navy. He believed that a strong navy would make Russia powerful. He ordered ships to be built and trained sailors to use them. For this, he needed access to the sea. At the time, Russia's ports were small and often frozen. Peter set his sights on the Baltic Sea, but it was controlled by Sweden, a strong military power. In 1700, Peter began the Great Northern War against Sweden. The war lasted more than 20 years. At first, Russia suffered terrible defeats. Swedish soldiers were better trained and better equipped. But Peter did not give up. He reorganized his army, trained his soldiers, and improved their weapons. Slowly, Russia began to win battles. In 1709, at the Battle of Poltava, Peter's army crushed the Swedish forces. It was a turning point. Russia was now a major power in Europe. During the war, Peter began building a new city, St. Petersburg. He wanted a city that would face Europe, not the old Russia of the past. He chose a swampy area near the Baltic Sea. The work was dangerous and hard. Thousands of workers died building the city. But Peter pushed forward. By 1712, St. Petersburg became the new capital of Russia. It was a city of elegance and light, with wide streets, canals, and grand palaces. Peter called it his window to the West. But Peter's reforms came at a cost. He ruled with an iron fist. Those who opposed him were punished harshly. The peasants, who made up most of the population, suffered under heavy taxes and forced labor. The changes were exciting for the nobles and city dwellers, but life in the countryside remained hard. Peter's personal life was also full of drama. He married twice and had many children, but tragedy followed him. His eldest son, Alexei, disagreed with his father's reforms. Peter believed Alexei was plotting against him. In 1718, Alexei was arrested and put on trial. He died in prison under mysterious circumstances. Peter's grief was great, but he believed that Russia's future was more important than family. Peter continued to work tirelessly. He traveled across his vast empire, inspecting projects and making decisions. He believed that a ruler should serve the country, not live in luxury. Even as he grew older, he remained active. In 1725, Peter fell ill after rescuing sailors from icy water. He died soon after, at the age of 52. Peter left behind a transformed Russia. He had expanded the country's borders, created a modern navy, and built a new capital. He had introduced new ideas, new technologies, and new ways of thinking. But his reign was not without pain. Many suffered under his rule, and his reforms created deep divisions. Still, Peter the Great remains one of Russia's most famous and influential rulers. As St. Petersburg's golden domes glistened in the sunlight, the people of Russia looked to the future. Their country was no longer isolated. It was a part of Europe, a part of the world. Peter's legacy was alive in the streets, the ships, and the dreams of a nation. His vision had changed Russia forever. Before we begin, Chapter 6, a quick note for our listeners. You're currently listening to this audiobook on Woo English. Remember, this content is specially made for Woo English listeners only. If you're hearing it on any other channel, it may be a violation of Woo English's rights. Please ensure you're tuned into the right source to fully enjoy and respect this audiobook journey. Now, let's continue the story. Chapter 5. Catherine the Great. Catherine the Great was not born in Russia. She was born in 1729 in a small German kingdom. Her name was Sophie, and her family was noble but not very powerful. As a child, she was clever and curious. She loved books and learning. Sophie dreamed of an exciting life beyond her quiet home. When Sophie was 15, her life changed forever. She was chosen to marry Peter, the heir to the Russian throne. She traveled to Russia, a land very different from her own. It was cold, vast, and filled with traditions she did not know. But Sophie was determined to succeed. She converted to the Orthodox Church, changed her name to Catherine, and began to learn the Russian language. She worked hard to understand the people and their culture. Catherine's husband, Peter, was not an easy man to love. He was childish, stubborn, and careless. Many people in the court did not like him. Catherine, however, was different. She was charming, smart, and diplomatic. She made friends with powerful nobles and won their trust. While Peter was careless, Catherine was always observing, always planning. In 1762, Peter became emperor, but his rule was short. Just a few months later, Catherine and her allies removed him from power. It was a bold and dangerous move. Catherine became the ruler of Russia. Some questioned her right to rule, but she proved them wrong. She was strong, confident, and ready to lead. As Empress, Catherine had big dreams for Russia. She wanted to make the country stronger and more modern. Like Peter the Great, she admired Europe and its ideas. She believed in the Enlightenment, a movement that valued reason, education, and progress. Catherine invited scientists, artists, and philosophers to her court. She even wrote letters to the famous French thinker Voltaire. Catherine worked hard to improve Russia. She reformed the government, making it more organized and efficient. She encouraged the building of schools, hospitals, and roads. She wanted more people to read and learn, so she supported the creation of libraries and the arts. Under her rule, Russia became a center of culture and knowledge. But Catherine was not just a lover of books and ideas. She was also a fierce leader. She expanded Russia's borders through war and diplomacy. She fought against the Ottoman Empire, winning new lands in the south. These lands gave Russia access to the Black Sea, opening new opportunities for trade. Catherine also took part in the partition of Poland, gaining more territory for her empire. By the end of her reign, Russia was larger than ever before. Catherine's reign was not without challenges. The peasants, who made up most of the population, lived hard lives. They worked long hours, paid heavy taxes, and had little freedom. In 1773, a man named Pugachev led a rebellion. He claimed to be the true Tsar and promised to free the peasants. Thousands joined him. The rebellion grew and violence spread. Villages were burned and many lives were lost. Catherine acted quickly. She sent her army to crush the rebellion. After months of fighting, Pugachev was captured and executed. The rebellion was over, but it left a scar. Catherine realized how much the peasants suffered. She wanted to help them, but feared losing the support of the nobles. It was a problem she could never fully solve. Despite these struggles, Catherine remained a powerful and admired leader. She was a woman in a world ruled by men, yet she commanded respect. Her court was full of elegance and splendor. She collected art, supported music, and built grand palaces. The Hermitage Museum, one of the largest in the world today, began with her personal collection. Catherine's personal life was just as dramatic as her rule. She had many lovers, some of whom became her close advisors. These relationships caused gossip, but Catherine did not care. She was always in control. She used her charm and intelligence to maintain her power. As Catherine grew older, she continued to work tirelessly. She believed that a ruler should serve the people. She wrote laws, led campaigns, and dreamed of even greater reforms. But in 1796, at the age of 67, Catherine passed away. Her death marked the end of an extraordinary reign. Catherine the Great left a lasting legacy. She transformed Russia into a major European power. She brought art, science, and education to her people. She expanded the empire and strengthened its position in the world. Yet her story is also one of ambition and sacrifice. She ruled with brilliance, but her choices came with a cost. As the sun set over St. Petersburg, the city she loved, the people of Russia remembered her as one of their greatest leaders. Catherine's life was a journey of courage, determination, and vision. Her name remains a symbol of strength and greatness, inspiring generations to come. Chapter 7. The Russian Revolution. The year was 1917. Russia was in chaos. The people were tired of hunger, tired of war, and tired of the Tsar. For centuries, the Tsars ruled Russia like kings. They had absolute power. The people obeyed them. But times were changing. The old ways no longer worked. World War I had brought great suffering. Russian soldiers were sent to fight, but they were not ready. They had little food, few weapons, and poor training. Thousands died in cold, muddy trenches. At home, the situation was no better. Families waited for bread that never came. Factories stopped working. Farmers could not grow enough food. Anger grew in every city, every village. Tsar Nicholas II, the ruler of Russia, was far from the people's pain. He lived in grand palaces, surrounded by luxury. But even he could not ignore the problems forever. In March 1917, protests erupted in Petrograd, the capital city. Thousands marched in the streets. They shouted for bread, for peace, and for change. Soldiers were sent to stop them, but many joined the protesters instead. The Tsar's power was crumbling. Nicholas II made a fateful decision. He stepped down from the throne. The Romanov dynasty, which had ruled for over 300 years, was no more. Russia was without a Tsar. A new government was formed, but it was weak. It could not fix the deep problems of the country. The people were still hungry. The soldiers were still dying. Hope began to fade. Amid the chaos, one man rose to lead. His name was Vladimir Lenin. Lenin was no ordinary man. He was a revolutionary. For years he had spoken about overthrowing the old system. He believed that power should belong to the workers and peasants, not to kings or nobles. His ideas were bold, radical, and dangerous. Lenin led a group called the Bolsheviks. They were determined to bring change, no matter the cost. The Bolsheviks promised peace for soldiers, bread for the hungry, and land for the peasants. Their words spread like fire. More and more people began to follow them. Suspense filled the air. Would they succeed? Or would they fail, like so many before them? In November 1917, the moment came. The Bolsheviks made their move. Armed workers and soldiers stormed the Winter Palace in Petrograd, where the government was based. The building was poorly defended. The takeover was quick and almost bloodless. By the end of the night, the Bolsheviks were in control. Lenin declared a new government. The Russian Revolution had begun. At first, it seemed like victory. Lenin and the Bolsheviks worked fast. They signed a peace treaty to end Russia's involvement in World War I. They redistributed land to the peasants. Factories were taken from the rich and given to the workers. For many, it felt like a new dawn. But the revolution was far from over. Not everyone supported the Bolsheviks. Some wanted the old ways back. Others wanted different ideas for Russia's future. Soon, the country was divided. A civil war broke out. On one side were the Bolsheviks, now called the Reds. On the other side were the Whites, a mix of groups opposed to Bolshevik rule. The Civil War was brutal. Villages burned. Families were torn apart. Hunger and disease spread like wildfire. The Reds fought with fierce determination, using harsh methods to keep control. The Whites had foreign allies, but they could not unite. Slowly, the Reds gained the upper hand. By 1921, the Bolsheviks had won. But the cost was immense. Millions were dead. Cities lay in ruins. The country was exhausted. Lenin now faced a new challenge: rebuilding Russia. He renamed the country the Soviet Union, a land ruled by workers' councils, or Soviets. It was a bold experiment. Lenin introduced policies to bring the economy back to life. Factories started running again. Farms began to produce food. But the scars of war and revolution were deep. In 1924, Lenin died after years of illness. His death left a question: who would lead next? Many believed that Leon Trotsky, a brilliant Bolshevik leader, would take over. But another man was rising quietly to power. His name was Joseph Stalin. Stalin was not as famous or charismatic as Lenin, but he was cunning and ruthless. By the late 1920s, Stalin had eliminated his rivals. He became the leader of the Soviet Union. The Russian Revolution changed the world forever. It ended centuries of monarchy and brought new ideas of equality and power to the people. But it also brought years of bloodshed, fear, and struggle. The promises of the revolution were great, but the reality was complex. As the dust settled, the people of Russia faced a new future. The old empire was gone, replaced by a new kind of state. What would this future hold? Only time would tell. The revolution was over, but its legacy was just beginning. Chapter 8. The Soviet Union is born. In 1922, a new country was born. It was called the Soviet Union, or the USSR. It was unlike anything the world had seen before. The Soviet Union was made up of many republics, with Russia as the largest. It was created after years of war and revolution. Its leaders promised a better life for workers and peasants. But the road ahead was not easy. Lenin was the first leader of the Soviet Union. He had big dreams. He wanted a country where people worked together for the common good. He believed in equality. Land, factories, and resources now belonged to the state. The government controlled everything. Lenin called this system socialism. The goal was to build a fair society. At first, things were difficult. The country was broken after years of civil war. Farms had been destroyed. Factories were silent. People faced hunger and disease. Lenin introduced a policy called the New Economic Policy, or NEP. This allowed small businesses and farms to operate freely. It helped the economy recover. Slowly, life began to improve. But in 1924, Lenin died. His death created a power struggle. Two men stood out, Leon Trotsky and Joseph Stalin. Trotsky was a brilliant speaker and writer. He had helped lead the revolution. Stalin, on the other hand, was quiet and calculating. He was not as famous as Trotsky, but he was clever. Stalin worked behind the scenes, building support. By the late 1920s, Stalin had won. Trotsky was exiled, and Stalin became the leader of the Soviet Union. Stalin had a different vision for the country. He wanted to make the Soviet Union a world power. To do this, he focused on industry and agriculture. In 1928, he introduced the first 5-year plan. Factories began producing steel, coal, and machinery. New cities rose from the ground. Huge dams and railways were built. It was a time of rapid change. But Stalin's plans came at a great cost. Farmers were forced to give up their land and join collective farms. These were large farms controlled by the government. Many resisted. Stalin responded harshly. Soldiers took grain, leaving families with nothing. Millions of people starved to death in what became known as the Great Famine. It was one of the darkest periods in Soviet history. Stalin also ruled through fear. He wanted complete control. In the 1930s, he began a campaign called the Great Purge. Anyone seen as a threat to his power was arrested. Politicians, military leaders, artists, and ordinary citizens were taken away. Many were sent to labor camps called gulags in Siberia. Others were executed. Families lived in fear, not knowing who would disappear next. Despite this, the Soviet Union continued to grow. By the late 1930s, it had become an industrial giant. Its army was one of the largest in the world. The country seemed strong, but beneath the surface, people were suffering. Freedom was limited, and fear ruled daily life. In 1941, the Soviet Union faced its greatest challenge. Nazi Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, invaded. The attack was sudden and brutal. Cities were bombed. Millions of soldiers and civilians died. The Soviet people fought back with incredible courage. The Battle of Stalingrad, one of the bloodiest battles in history, became a symbol of Soviet strength. After years of fighting, the Red Army pushed the Nazis back and marched into Berlin in 1945. The Soviet Union had won the war, but the victory came at a terrible cost. Over 20 million Soviets had died. After the war, the Soviet Union was a global superpower. It controlled much of Eastern Europe. Countries like Poland, Hungary, and East Germany became part of its sphere of influence. The world was now divided into two sides: the Soviet Union and the United States. This began the Cold War, a period of tension and competition. Stalin continued to rule with an iron fist until his death in 1953. By then, the Soviet Union had changed the world. It was a symbol of both hope and fear. For some, it represented progress and equality. For others, it was a place of oppression and suffering. The early years of the Soviet Union were a mix of dreams and nightmares. It was a time of great ambition and great sacrifice. Chapter 9. The Great Patriotic War. In 1941, the Soviet Union faced its darkest hour. Nazi Germany, led by Adolf Hitler, launched a massive invasion. It was called Operation Barbarossa. German tanks, planes, and soldiers swept across the border. The attack was sudden and brutal. The Soviet people were not ready. Towns fell quickly. Cities burned. Fear spread across the land. The Soviet Union called this conflict the Great Patriotic War. It was not just a war for survival. It was a fight for the future. Hitler wanted to destroy the Soviet Union. He wanted its land, its resources, and its people. But the Soviets would not give up without a fight. The German army pushed deeper into Soviet territory. By the autumn of 1941, they reached the gates of Moscow. The capital was under threat. The air was cold and snow began to fall. Soviet soldiers dug trenches and prepared to defend their city. Women and children worked to build defenses. Everyone played a part. In the Battle of Moscow, the Red Army fought with great courage. They stopped the Germans just miles from the city. For the first time, the Nazi advance was halted. It was a small victory, but it gave the Soviet people hope. Winter came, and the German army was not prepared for the freezing cold. They suffered heavy losses and were forced to retreat. But the war was far from over. In the summer of 1942, Hitler launched another major attack. This time, his target was Stalingrad, a city on the Volga River. Stalingrad was an important industrial center. If the Nazis captured it, they would cut off Soviet supplies. The battle that followed became one of the bloodiest in history. For months, the fighting raged. German planes bombed the city, turning buildings to rubble. Soldiers fought in the streets, in the ruins, and even underground. The Soviets refused to surrender. They knew what was at stake. Families were torn apart. Fathers and sons went to war. Mothers waited for news that might never come. The turning point came in the winter of 1943. The Red Army surrounded the German forces in Stalingrad. Trapped and starving, the Germans had no choice but to surrender. It was a great victory for the Soviet Union. The people celebrated, but the cost was high. Over 1 million Soviet soldiers and civilians had died. The city was destroyed, but it had not fallen. Stalingrad became a symbol of Soviet strength and determination. After Stalingrad, the Red Army began to push the Germans back. Town by town, city by city, they reclaimed their land. The fighting was fierce. Soldiers faced hunger, cold, and death, but they did not stop. The Soviet people knew they were fighting for their homeland, for their families, and for their future. By 1944, the Red Army had reached Eastern Europe. They liberated countries that had been occupied by the Nazis. The horrors of war became clear. In Poland, they discovered concentration camps where millions of innocent people had been killed. The soldiers were shocked and horrified. They knew they had to end the war, no matter the cost. In May 1945, the Red Army entered Berlin, the capital of Nazi Germany. The city was in ruins. Soviet soldiers raised their flag over the Reichstag, the German parliament building. The war in Europe was over. Victory had come, but it had been paid for with blood. Over 27 million Soviet people had died. Entire cities had been destroyed. Families had been torn apart forever. The Soviet Union emerged from the war as a global power. Its people had shown incredible bravery and sacrifice. They had endured hunger, fear, and loss, but they had not given up. The Great Patriotic War became a source of pride and sorrow for generations. It was a reminder of the courage and strength of the Soviet people, even in the darkest times. The war was over, but its memory lived on. It shaped the Soviet Union and the world for years to come. The scars remained, but so did the lessons. The Great Patriotic War was not just a fight for survival. It was a story of bravery, loss, and triumph that would never be forgotten. Chapter 10. Cold War Shadows. After World War II, the world changed. Two superpowers emerged, the United States and the Soviet Union. They were allies during the war, but now they were rivals. Each wanted to shape the future. Each believed their way was the best. The United States supported democracy and capitalism. The Soviet Union stood for communism. Their rivalry was called the Cold War. The Cold War was not a war with battles or bombs. It was a war of ideas, technology, and influence. Both sides wanted to be the strongest. Both wanted to lead the world. The tension was everywhere. People wondered, would it turn into a real war? One of the first signs of this rivalry was in Europe. After the war, the Soviet Union controlled Eastern Europe. Countries like Poland, Hungary, and East Germany were under Soviet influence. The United States and its allies supported Western Europe. The world was divided by an invisible line called the Iron Curtain. In 1949, the Cold War took another turn. The Soviet Union tested its first atomic bomb. Before this, only the United States had nuclear weapons. Now, both sides had the power to destroy each other. People lived in fear. What if a war broke out? What if nuclear bombs were used? The threat of destruction was always in the air. The arms race began. Both sides built more and more weapons. The Soviet Union spent huge amounts of money on its military. Missiles, tanks, and planes were produced in large numbers. Schools taught children what to do in case of an attack. Families built shelters underground. The fear of war shaped daily life. At the same time, another race was beginning, the space race. In 1957, the Soviet Union launched the first satellite, Sputnik, into space. It was a small, silver ball, but it sent shockwaves around the world. People looked up at the sky and saw the future. The Soviets had taken the lead in space. The United States quickly responded. The race to space became a symbol of the Cold War. Both sides wanted to show their strength. In 1961, the Soviet Union made history again. Yuri Gagarin became the first human to travel to space. He orbited the Earth and returned safely. The Soviet people were proud. Their country was reaching the stars. But life on the ground was not as bright. In the Soviet Union, people worked hard, but resources were limited. The government controlled everything: factories, farms, and even what people could say. Goods like meat, sugar, and shoes were often in short supply. People waited in long lines for basic items. Life was not easy. The government also kept a close eye on its citizens. The secret police, the KGB, watched for anyone who disagreed with the state. People who spoke out could be arrested, sent to labor camps, or worse. Fear was part of life. Spies worked in the shadows, both inside and outside the Soviet Union. Some spied for the Soviets, others spied against them. Trust was rare. Suspicion was everywhere. One of the most dramatic moments of the Cold War came in 1962. It was called the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Soviet Union placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, close to the United States. The world held its breath. Would there be a war? For 13 tense days, leaders from both sides negotiated. In the end, the Soviet Union removed the missiles. The crisis was over, but the danger remained. Throughout the Cold War, the Soviet government promised progress. New factories were built, and education was free for everyone. Scientists and engineers were celebrated. In cities, people saw signs of modern life: new apartments, buses, and subways. But in the countryside, many still lived in poverty. Farmers worked on collective farms, earning little for their efforts. The Soviet Union tried to spread its influence around the world. It supported communist movements in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Countries like China, Vietnam, and Cuba became allies. The United States, in turn, supported its own allies. Conflicts broke out in places like Korea and Afghanistan, where both sides fought indirectly. By the 1970s, people in the Soviet Union began to feel the strain. The government spent huge amounts on weapons and space projects, but ordinary people wanted better lives. Food shortages became more common. The economy slowed. People whispered about change, but few dared to speak openly. Despite the challenges, Soviet culture thrived in some ways. Writers, filmmakers, and artists created works that reflected both hope and struggle. Sports brought moments of pride. Soviet athletes competed in the Olympics, winning medals and admiration. Ice hockey became a source of national pride, especially when the Soviet team faced the United States. As the 1980s approached, cracks began to appear in the Soviet system. The Cold War had lasted for decades. The Soviet Union had achieved great things, but at a great cost. The people were tired. The world was watching. What would happen next? The shadows of the Cold War lingered, but change was on the horizon. Chapter 11. The Fall of the Soviet Union. In 1991, the world witnessed an event no one had thought possible. The Soviet Union, a superpower for decades, collapsed. Its fall marked the end of an era. But how did this happen? What caused such a powerful nation to break apart? The story begins with Mikhail Gorbachev. Mikhail Gorbachev became the leader of the Soviet Union in 1985. He was different from the leaders before him. He was young, energetic, and full of ideas. Gorbachev knew that the Soviet Union was in trouble. The economy was weak. Factories were outdated. Food shortages were common. People stood in long lines for bread and basic goods. Change was needed, and Gorbachev was determined to bring it. He introduced two major reforms. The first was called glasnost, or openness. Under glasnost, people were allowed to speak more freely. Newspapers could criticize the government. Citizens could discuss problems openly for the first time in decades. For many, this was exciting. For others, it was shocking. The silence of fear was breaking. The second reform was perestroika, or restructuring. This focused on the economy. Gorbachev wanted to modernize factories and farms. He allowed some private businesses to open, something new in a communist system. But these changes were slow and difficult. The economy struggled to improve. People were frustrated. They wanted faster results. As glasnost spread, old wounds reopened. People began to talk about past events that had been hidden for years. They spoke about the Great Purge, the gulags, and the millions who had suffered under Stalin. They discussed the Great Famine and the hardships of war. The truth was painful, but it could no longer be ignored. At the same time, the Soviet Union's republics began to demand independence. The Soviet Union was made up of 15 republics, including Russia, Ukraine, and the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. For years, these republics had been controlled by Moscow. Now, they wanted freedom. Protests grew louder. In 1990, Lithuania declared its independence. Other republics followed. The unity of the Soviet Union was breaking apart. Gorbachev tried to hold the country together. He wanted to reform the system, not destroy it. But events were moving too fast. In August 1991, hardline communists staged a coup. They wanted to remove Gorbachev and return to the old ways. Tanks rolled into Moscow. The world watched, holding its breath. Would the Soviet Union return to dictatorship? But something unexpected happened. Thousands of people took to the streets. They stood in front of the tanks, unafraid. They demanded freedom. Boris Yeltsin, the leader of Russia, became a hero. He climbed onto a tank and called for the end of the coup. The plotters gave up. The coup had failed, but it showed how weak the Soviet Union had become. After the coup, everything changed quickly. The republics declared their independence one by one. By December 1991, the Soviet Union no longer existed. On Christmas Day, Gorbachev resigned. The red Soviet flag was lowered for the last time. The Russian flag rose in its place. The Soviet Union was gone. The fall of the Soviet Union brought mixed emotions. For many, it was a moment of hope. People dreamed of freedom, democracy, and a better life. But for others, it was a time of uncertainty. The economy collapsed. Factories closed. Jobs disappeared. Prices for food and goods skyrocketed. Families struggled to survive. The transition was painful. Russia, now an independent country, faced enormous challenges. Boris Yeltsin became the first president. He promised reforms, but the road was difficult. Corruption grew. A small group of businessmen, called oligarchs, became very rich, while most people stayed poor. Crime increased. Many wondered if life under the Soviet Union had been better. But the fall of the Soviet Union also brought opportunities. People could speak freely. New ideas and businesses appeared. Russia opened itself to the world. Young people dreamed of traveling, learning, and building a new future. The old walls of fear were gone. The collapse of the Soviet Union changed not only Russia, but the world. The Cold War was over. The United States was now the world's only superpower. Countries in Eastern Europe, once controlled by the Soviet Union, began to join NATO and the European Union. The balance of power had shifted. Looking back, the fall of the Soviet Union was a moment of great change. It marked the end of a superpower and the birth of a new Russia. It was a story of hope, struggle, and uncertainty. For the people who lived through it, it was a time they would never forget. The shadows of the past had lifted, and a new chapter had begun. But the future was still unwritten. Chapter 12. Russia. Today. Russia today is a land of contrasts. It is the largest country in the world, stretching across 11 time zones. Its vast landscapes include icy tundras, green forests, wide plains, and towering mountains. Russia's geography is breathtaking, but it also presents challenges. Connecting people and resources across such a huge land is no easy task. Moscow, the capital, is a city of energy and ambition. It is home to over 12 million people. The Kremlin stands at its center, a symbol of Russia's power and history. Red Square, with its colorful St. Basil's Cathedral, attracts visitors from around the globe. The city mixes old traditions with modern life. Skyscrapers rise beside historic churches. Luxury shops line streets where poets once walked. St. Petersburg, often called Russia's cultural capital, is another jewel. Built by Peter the Great, it remains a city of elegance. Its canals and palaces remind visitors of Europe, but its soul is deeply Russian. The Hermitage Museum, one of the largest in the world, holds treasures of art and history. Each summer, the White Nights bring endless daylight, filling the streets with music and celebrations. Russia's cultural heritage is one of its greatest strengths. Its writers, composers, and artists are known worldwide. The works of Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Chekhov continue to inspire readers. The music of Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninoff fills concert halls. The Bolshoi and Mariinsky theaters bring ballet to life with stunning performances. Russian art, from the golden icons of ancient churches to the bold experiments of the 20th century, reflects a rich and complex history. Today, the Russian people take pride in their traditions. Festivals mark the changing seasons. In winter, people celebrate Maslenitsa, a week of pancakes, sledding, and fun. In spring, Orthodox Easter brings brightly painted eggs and special bread. Summer is a time for gathering berries in the forests, while autumn celebrates the harvest. These traditions connect the past with the present. At the same time, Russia faces many challenges. The fall of the Soviet Union brought freedom, but also difficulties. Economic inequality remains high. While some live in wealth, many struggle to make ends meet. Villages far from the big cities lack resources. Schools and hospitals need improvement. Corruption in politics and business adds to the problems. The younger generation dreams of a better future. Many young Russians study abroad or start their own businesses. They bring fresh ideas and energy to the country. Technology is growing, and Russian engineers and scientists continue to make advances. The space program, once a source of great pride, remains active, sending astronauts to the International Space Station. Russia's role in the world is complex. It is a major global power, rich in oil, gas, and other resources. It has a strong military and a seat at international decision-making tables. But its relationships with other countries are often tense. Conflicts, sanctions, and differing views on global issues create challenges. Many wonder what direction Russia will take in the future. Despite these difficulties, the Russian people remain resilient. They have endured centuries of wars, revolutions, and hardships. Through it all, they have kept their identity and spirit. Their love of family, community, and tradition runs deep. Their sense of humor helps them face life's struggles. Nature plays a big role in Russian life. The vast wilderness is a source of pride and inspiration. The taiga, the largest forest in the world, is home to bears, wolves, and eagles. Lake Baikal, the deepest lake on Earth, holds 20% of the world's fresh water. In winter, snow blankets the land, and ice fishing becomes a favorite pastime. In summer, the countryside comes alive with flowers and sunshine. Russia today is a land of hope and uncertainty. It looks back on its history with pride, but also with questions. What lessons can be learned from the past? How can the future be brighter for all its people? These are the questions that shape the nation now. As the sun sets over Moscow's golden domes and rises again on the snowy peaks of Siberia, one thing is clear. Russia is a country of incredible strength and beauty. It is a land of poets and pioneers, of dreamers and builders. Its story is not finished. It continues to unfold, full of possibilities and promise. The world watches, wondering what the next chapter will bring.